Right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my artist talk. It's wonderful to see so many of you and so many familiar faces in the audience. There will be a slight overlap with what Rachel already said, but not too much, I hope. As you know, I'm Miriam Rudolph, and I'm a printmaker based here in Winnipeg. I was born and raised in Paraguay in a small Mennonite town in the Chaco. In 2003, I moved to Winnipeg to study fine arts at the University of Manitoba. There, I was introduced to printmaking, and I fell in love with the medium. I was fascinated with the technical skills required to make a print because of the variety of processes involved, starting with preparing and etching the printing plates with countless ways to create marks on the copper surface, followed by mixing inks, inking and wiping the plates, the handling of specialty papers, and ultimately the printing itself, which is magic every time. Working with many small plates allows me to break down the complicated themes I work with into small portions, which I then reassemble in multi-layered complex prints by taking advantage of their reproducibility. I completed a master's in printmaking in 2017, and I'm now settled here in Winnipeg with a house, a home studio, a large vegetable garden, my husband, and our little son, Max. I acknowledge that I grew up on the territory of the Intlit in Paraguay, and that I currently live on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The work I will present today is part of a lifelong journey of watching and questioning the narratives and relationships of settler and Indigenous communities. During the pandemic, I worked on a long-distance artist residency with the British Museum, for which I had been invited to create work in response to their Paraguay collection in storage. This collection consists of Indigenous artifacts collected around the turn of the 20th century by an Anglican missionary. Being a descendant of white settlers in the area, I decided to use these artifacts as the starting point to question history. Whose experience, whose history is being told, preserved, taught, and perpetuated? I used my research to create a multi-layered narrative of the colonization processes from the perspectives of the local Indigenous people, the Anglican missionary, and the Euro-Canadian Mennonite settlers. As a side note, I will show that body of work at Martha Street Studio in April, and also at the Mennonite Heritage Gallery at CMU, the Canadian Mennonite University, in September, if you're interested. So following that online presentation of my work, I was approached by the Winnipeg Art Gallery's curator, Riva Simcoe, with an invitation to create a similar series with a focus on multiple narratives, while exploring the history of Winnipeg through the archives of the Winnipeg Free Press, as part of this exhibition, Headlines, The Art of the News Cycle. Of course, I said yes. Newspapers are so closely related to what I do as a printmaker, which is also part of my DNA, since my paternal grandfather was a typesetter for a small local newspaper in Germany. Tonight, I would like to present a body of work that resulted from this invitation. Storied Land, Remapping Winnipeg is an artist's book exploring segments of the colonial and racial history of settlement in Manitoba and Winnipeg through the use of layered etchings that recall the diverging narratives of experiences. These histories have been sourced from local newspaper archives and from various accounts of Indigenous people, Métis people, and Mennonite settlers. This project gave me the opportunity to learn more about the colonial history of Winnipeg. It also allowed me to further explore the colonial history of my own roots and challenge the settler narratives that I grew up with. My maternal great-great-great-grandparents were among the early Mennonite settlers that migrated to Manitoba between 1874 to 1877. They settled in the East and West Reserves on land granted to them by the Canadian government, but which had already been at least partially requested by local Métis residents. As part of my research, I accessed the archives of the Winnipeg Free Press, both online and at the Legislative Library, across the street from the WAG here. I also visited the Mennonite Heritage Center archives. Sorry, I'm a little behind with my slides. This is still the Legislative Library. I read articles and books by local historians and Indigenous authors that offer new and critical perspectives on many of the city's developments. I chose to work with a cross-section of themes from the past 150 years where colonization histories of the province or the city intersect in some form with Mennonite history, either in the context of Indigenous or Métis dispossession or the support of reconciliation efforts. What I noticed, unsurprisingly, in my research, was the absence of Indigenous or Métis perspectives until more recent years, and the use of racist and derogatory language that reflected the settler sentiments and supported settler interests, which is why it was important for me to look at information sources beyond the Winnipeg Free Press. As Riva Simcoe, the curator of this exhibition, sums it up in the exhibition catalog, news coverage influences who and what is important enough to be part of local, national, and international dialogues, and by extension, histories. To set up my narratives, I pull direct quotations from news stories dating as far back as 1874 and following their chronological trajectories to recent times. Each page then becomes its own self-contained summarized narrative representing various perspectives of each theme. The format of the print and the layout of the text resembles the format of newspaper pages, highlighting the importance of the role newspapers play in shaping our narratives and perceptions. The inclusions of digitally printed maps, contemporary satellite imagery, and grids represents the settler practices of land surveying, mapping, organizing, privatizing, and settlement, as well as the colonial imposition of a certain kind of order, of will, a way of life, and a way of thinking. In the prints, I explore the imagery of lightly or deeply etched figures of men, women, and children. The size and the strength of the etching of the figures reflects the power dynamics between the different groupings. The translucence of the groupings of figures representing Indigenous or Métis people suggests a non-solid, precarious presence and at times marginal existence. However, in the first and last print, the layering of the figures creates darker tones, giving them a stronger presence, which is also reflected in the representation of ribbon skirts and drums, symbols of strength, pride, and self-confidence that stand for a reclaiming of identity that goes along with the reclaiming of history and of land. I am aware that the portrayal of Indigenous people by settlers, such as me, can potentially be problematic, but I hope that these prints will be a point of conversation rather than a point of contention. Print 1, a season of historical reckoning. I begin with the archives and the newspaper itself, the starting point for this project. I visited the archives at the Legislative Library, where physical copies of the early editions of the Manitoba and Winnipeg Free Press are held. I have included some photos of the storage area in this print. The grid I'm using throughout the series also fits here as an organizational tool to organize and categorize and store information and collective knowledge of history based on a Eurocentric knowledge system. I populated the print with figures that signify settlers and Indigenous community members because the access to our archives is public and part of our shared history. With all its inclusions and omissions of information, it is also a reclaiming of space and diverse voices. The Free Press claims in an advertisement from 2022, quote, The Winnipeg Free Press has faithfully recorded the evolution of our province and shared the histories of its readers for over 145 years. Discover your family's history as you search through newspaper pages dating back to 1874." Unquote. By including the ad in this context, I put this claim into question since there are so many angles and histories missing. While I, as a descendant of settlers, was able to find traces of my community's history dating back to 1874, I doubt a person with a BIPOC background might be able to say the same. Archives and newspapers give us access to parts of our history, evidenced in the reporting, but also in the omissions in that same reporting. I'm interested in the language and tone that is used in the reporting and how it has changed over the years, particularly in the way Indigenous and Métis people, as well as settlers, are represented. On the other hand, these representations are a reflection of a perception. On the one hand, these representations are a reflection of the perception of racial differences in their time. On the other hand, they have played and continue to play a critical role in shaping public opinion. Print 2, a dream that is not all a dream. Part of my family's history has always been the migration of Mennonites from Russia or modern-day Ukraine to Manitoba before migrating further to Paraguay. I took my family's link to Manitoba as the starting point for my research into the settlement history of this province. The Daily Free Press reports on August 1st, 1874, quote, "The first installments of the Mennonites, consisting of 65 families, or 380 persons, arrived last night by the International. The individuals composing the party seem to be composed of exactly the right sort of stuff, physically, for pioneer life, and this, taken in connection with the well-known frugal habits and thriftiness of the Germans, ensure their prosperity here. We may congratulate ourselves upon so valuable an acquisition to our population." Unquote. While my maternal great-great-great-grandparents were not on that very first ship that arrived in Winnipeg, they were part of the subsequent groups that arrived between 1874 to 1877, and I imagine the situation and sentiment towards them would have been similar. This praising tone continues in a speech by Governor General Lord Dufferin, printed in the Manitoba Daily Free Press 3 years later in 1877. Quote, "A vice-regal visit, trip to the Mennonites. Seldom have I, Lord Dufferin, beheld any spectacle more pregnant with prophecy, more fraught with promise of an astonishing future than the Mennonite settlement. When I visited these interesting people, they had been only 2 years in the province, and yet in a long ride I took across the prairies, which but yesterday was absolutely bare, desolate and untenanted, and the home of the wolf, the badger, and the eagle. I passed village after village, homestead after homestead, furnished with all the conveniences and incidents of European comfort and a scientific agriculture, while on either side of the road, cornfields already ripe for harvest, and pastures populous with herds of cattle stretched away to the horizon." Unquote. This excerpt reflects the colonial attitude and understanding of the world of political representatives, which view the land as a terra nullius, an empty, uninhabited land where the bare and desolate landscape turns into flourishing and thriving fields and pastures under the hands of the European settlers. It is the land of the wild animals, but the original inhabitants do not exist in this speech. Their presence is erased and unacknowledged. The background of this print is a digitally printed map of Manitoba from 1876, where I have highlighted the Mennonite land reserves, known as East Reserve around the Steinbach area, and West Reserve in the Winkler area in red. A Métis family is pushed to the margins, while large looming figures representing settler families fill the space. Several contemporary Mennonite scholars have wrestled with the settlement history, following paper trails of dispossession of Métis families in the East Reserve area, families that after 20 years of legal battles were finally granted land elsewhere. As Donovan Giesbrecht writes, quote, "The struggles of these Métis claimants challenged the notion of an unoccupied prairie settled by Mennonite immigrants who were not intruding on others," unquote. I did not find Indigenous perspectives printed in the Free Press regarding the settlement history of the province, but I chose a few texts from secondary sources, such as Wabung, Our Tomorrows, by the Indian Tribes of Manitoba, 1971, which states, quote, "The terms of the treaties were unconscionable in that they did not ensure fair and equitable treatment to us and must rank in history as one of the outstanding swindles of all time. The Indian people of that day could not possibly have anticipated the massive immigration of white settlers to this country. The concept of private property was alien to Indian people," unquote. In 2004, Elijah Harper, Cree politician, writes in a speech, "What Canada means to me," quote, "Our forefathers had difficulty understanding the concept of owning land. It is alien, like the concept of owning air." He concludes that there needs to be a healing of the land and the people. There needs to be reconciliation, restoration, and restitution, unquote. Print 3. Reconciliation requires a bigger dream. The third print represents the Canadian Pacific Railway and Yards, constructed in 1882, whose network of tracks still divides and shapes the city to this day, not just in a geographic, but also in a social and economic way. Running through the center of the print is a digital satellite image of the current-day CP railway yards. The location of the rail yards has been controversial for decades. The first excerpt I chose to introduce the story is from the Manitoba Free Press, July 1881, which introduces a new bylaw which, quote, "forthwith grants to the Canadian Pacific Company a bonus of $200,000 on condition of said company establishing and building their workshops and cattle yards for the lines in the province of Manitoba in the city of Winnipeg, and running their main line through the city of Winnipeg, and centering their workshops, stockyards, and main line at the city of Winnipeg forever," unquote. Edith Patterson elaborates in the Free Press in 1974, quote, "Manitoba historians have recorded little about the battle Winnipeggers put up to get the main line of the Canadian Pacific Railway to cross the Red River here instead of at Selkirk. But it was a struggle that lasted from 1874, when it was announced that the line would miss Winnipeg completely, right up to 1881, when the city fathers concluded an arrangement with the syndicate building the railway. Finally, after many meetings, the syndicate outlined its terms. It demanded, among other requirements, a bonus of $200,000, also that its property would be exempt from municipal taxes forever. In return, it would establish workshops and cattle yards here. The CPR didn't need Winnipeg, but Winnipeg needed the CPR. And that was how Winnipeg won the railway and was saved from being a ghost town," unquote. Leo Dreger, Mennonite sociologist, describes how the rail yards shaped the geography and social demographics of the city. Quote, "The Canadian Pacific Railway, the first national railway, came into Winnipeg in 1882, separating the northern part of the city from the central and southern parts. City developers encouraged the character of the North End as a working class and immigrant area by building cheap houses on small lots north of the tracks. Eastern Europeans, especially Jews, Ukrainians, Poles, and Germans, and among them also early urban Mennonite migrants, settled there. While the North End has always been separated from the city's southern, more Anglo-Saxon parts, the railroad assured its spatial and social segregation as hundreds of freight trains choked the tracks, blocking traffic to the North End. unquote. In 2016, Free Press journalist Randy Turner dares to dream about a changed city. Quote, "Imagine a Winnipeg without rail lines. It's circa 2035, and the Weston yards that have occupied the steel-lined landscape for more than a century have vanished and re-emerged as a new neighborhood, complete with boutique shops and residential apartments. There's a sprawling park under the shadow of the Arlington Bridge. The original Canadian Pacific Railway line, which since 1882 has served as the great cultural divide between North and South Winnipeg, is no more," unquote. In the online portal Policy Options, Diane Roosen and Taylor Wilson emphasize the importance of the inclusion of Indigenous voices in decision-making. Quote, "Reimagining urban centers is not new for Indigenous people. As we've grown and adapted to the ever-changing landscapes of our traditional territories, we constantly imagine what these spaces would look like if we had a say in urban planning. We need to include different voices. Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada alike are facing complex social challenges, and now we need to deal with them in new ways. Tapping into different kinds of wisdom is essential. Indigenous knowledge, experience, perspective, and wisdom are by and large untapped as a source for deriving social challenge solutions," unquote. Print 4 and 5, Growth of Winnipeg Suburbs. In prints 4 and 5, I portrayed the Métis settlement of Roostertown side by side with the early Rurban Mennonite settlement in North Kildonan. It struck me how similar the living conditions and poverty appear to have been in both communities. However, the narrative surrounding the settlements differ dramatically. While the inhabitants of Roostertown are repeatedly stigmatized and blamed for their own poverty, the Mennonite settlers are praised for their achievements despite adversity. For those of you who haven't heard of Roostertown, just briefly, it was a Métis settlement, often referred to as a shanty town on the southern fringes of Winnipeg from around 1900 to 1959, when it was demolished to make way for Grant Park Mall and school. Heard of Roostertown? It's our lost suburb. In this print, you can see a digitally printed map of the Roostertown households in 1951, mostly located between Grant and Hector Avenue. The Winnipeg Tribune printed an article in 1951. Quote, "The people who live in Roostertown are Métis. Destitute, they threw up shacks on Canadian National Railway's property. The population of Roostertown is small, but it presents one of the stickiest social problems in the Winnipeg area. Children raised in the filth and squalor of Roostertown are sent to the spanking new Rockwood School, 10 minutes away cross-country. Parents in other areas using Rockwood School are naturally worried about their children's health. Whatever you do, they warn, don't touch the Roostertown children. You might get a skin disease," unquote. In the same year, the Winnipeg Free Press wrote, "This is Roostertown." Quote, "Water, that's all they want for Christmas. Folks in Roostertown get along on practically nothing, but they can't do without water. It's a tough problem. The pump that serves the community is about a mile away. The dilapidated shacks are scattered through the brush, and in sharp contrast, just across the Canadian National Railway's main line, is the bright paint of the newly built-up area south of Corridon Avenue. Because it's so hard to lug every drop of water a whole mile, cleanliness and sanitation in the town aren't all they should be. Result, impetigo, scabies, and other skin diseases, whooping cough, chicken pox, and so on. They have no plumbing, no sewers, and they're crowded into those little shacks and sleeping in some cases 4 to a bed," unquote. 8 years later, 1959, Free Press staff writer John Defoe writes, quote, Rooster Town is dying. As the prairie moved south, the Rooster Towners loaded up their scrapwood shacks and moved on, farther into the prairie. And as they moved, their place was taken by some of Winnipeg's most elegant homes. The worthless prairie on which the Rooster Towners squatted became the city's most expensive residential land. No one is sure where Rooster Town got its name. It's been called that as long as I can remember, said Gerald O'Brien, assistant director of the city's welfare department. Maybe it's because a lot of them used to keep chickens. Even now there are chickens running wild all through the bush. You turn them up everywhere you step. By summer, Rooster Town will be gone, unquote. Almost 60 years later, Winnipeg Free Press journalist Randy Turner reevaluates this history in 2016. Quote, "They were invisible then, they are invisible now. They were intensely poor," said Evelyn Joy Peters, professor of urban geography at the University of Winnipeg, who specializes in Métis and First Nations people in city environments. They faced enormous prejudice, but they were trying to make a better future for their kids, and they did. Consider the roots of Rooster Town. The original settlers were Métis, who first arrived on the outskirts of Winnipeg in the 1880s, Peters said. Many, if not all, had never received the land they'd been promised under the Manitoba Act. So their goal was to find employment in the growing city, mostly seasonal jobs and hard labor. Rooster Town people were never welcome in Winnipeg to begin with, said retired University of Winnipeg history professor David Burley, who described the treatment of residents as municipal colonization. Being Métis in the city through the 19th and 20th centuries meant being subject to racism and even violence. They ended up marginalizing them both physically and socially. They were pushed to the edge of the city or beyond town limits, and many of the kinds of services that Winnipeg residents of European background had just weren't available for them. Sewers, water. Burley told the story of a Métis woman, now in her 50s, who attended Rockwood. Her mother would scrub her children before sending them to school just so no one could ever possibly accuse them of being dirty. That was something that was a very important part of her childhood, the importance of being clean. Because being clean was the opposite of the stereotype many people had of Métis people. Unquote. For more information about Rooster Town, I can highly recommend the book Rooster Town by Evelyn Peters, Matthew Stock, and Adrian Werner, published in 2018. They point out that the majority of residents of Rooster Town were employed and not on welfare, and some even paid property taxes on the land they lived. Also based on photographs in obituaries and weddings from that time, the Métis families could have fit in anywhere in middle-class Winnipeg society. In recent years, reappraisals of history have led to the Public Art Commission of the Rooster Town Kettle by Métis artist Ian August and the renaming of an area park as Rooster Town Park to commemorate the local history. Print 5, the Rurban Village in North Kildonan. As mentioned before, it struck me how similar the living conditions and poverty appear to have been in both communities. That is, the simple two-room houses, getting water from pumps every day, and muddy streets. I used the image of the same simple house in both prints, with the more affluent neighborhoods either encroaching or being within easy distance. The digitally printed background in this print is a sketch map of the early Mennonite village in North Kildonan from 1930. The Mennonite settlement on the outskirts of Winnipeg started in 1928. These were Mennonites which came in a later migration wave from Russia as a result of the turbulences following World War I believe. Two Mennonite land agents searched for land in the vicinity of Winnipeg and listed the following ad in the Mennonitische Rundschau in 1928. Quote, "Garden Village near Winnipeg. 4 miles from the center of the city, we have reserved a piece of land for Mennonites, which will be given to them in plots of 3 acres. Each family receives a house and wood for a barn. For every 4 families, there is a well with good drinking water. The land is deep black soil. The yield is excellent. It is situated in what is recognized as the best vegetable district in Winnipeg." Unquote. Leo Dreger further elaborates, quote, "Mennonites arriving in 1928 had to clear the land. Pictures show the area to be bleak and desolate. 2 Mennonite land agents found a 20-acre piece of land near Winnipeg where Mennonites could operate small farms to supply the city with garden and dairy produce. 8 chicken barns went up on what is now Edison Avenue. Mennonites who moved to Edison were not well-to-do at the beginning. The DeFair family turned the original chicken barn into a small woodworking factory, which became the largest plant of its kind in Canada, Palliser Furniture." Unquote. Most of the information sources for this piece I found at the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where I also came across these personal anecdotes of early settlers, such as the following excerpt by Irmgard Duc Regehr. Quote, "My parents arrived in Canada in February 1930. Quite a few of our Mennonite people had already settled in North Kildonan. Dad was thankful that he could find work in the vegetable gardens owned by the Dutch people who had settled here earlier. He often worked up to 10 hours a day at $1 a day, but it was something. At that time, the area of North Kildonan was just being opened up. There were a few streets leading off Henderson Highway. My dad bought a little lot on McKay. There were stumps in the mud road. In spring, the road was such gumbo. My dad got this little lot. A little shell, a 2-room shell was put up. Actually, that's all it was, a shell. My dad built it. We were surrounded by much bush. We were all pioneers at that time, and we were all very poor. These early years, there wasn't any electricity. That came a few years later. My mother said what a great relief it was too when the electricity came and they could buy an old kind of washing machine. So that was a great help. Really a progressive thing, you know? That was a good thing." Unquote. Olga Dick Regehr adds that, quote, "My father built a little house on Edison. Actually, it was a house with a barn attached. They started raising chickens. We had chickens on one side of our house. We were very poor." Unquote. John Unruh writes for the 50th anniversary of the Mennonite settlement in North Kildonan, 1978. Quote, "50 years have gone by since the first Mennonite settlers came to North Kildonan. With undaunted hope, with diligence, at last but not least, with a strong trust in God, difficulties were overcome. Hard times outlived, and advantage was taken of opportunities that happened to come along the way." Unquote. Also, for the 50th anniversary of the Mennonite settlement in North Kildonan, 1978, came the congratulations by the then Premier of Manitoba, Sterling Lyon. Quote, "I am pleased to have the opportunity to extend my greetings and good wishes to the Mennonite people of North Kildonan. Arriving in Winnipeg without any kind of worldly possessions, they applied hard work and thrift, their widely recognized characteristics, to their market gardens, chicken farms, and other ventures. In time, these were expanded and became thriving industries. Their contribution to the Canadian way of life has been and will continue to be of great value." Unquote. As we can see, while the Mennonite settlers emerged as a thriving community, the Métis community remained impoverished and was eventually demolished. Through the narratives and the prints, I suggest that racism shaped these different developments. The Mennonite immigrants were able to buy land and were given materials to build their first dwellings. Although poor, they were privileged right from the start. The white settlers also received municipal amenities such as electricity and running water that helped them grow and build their homes and businesses. The Métis residents of Roostertown did not receive such amenities, despite pleas for the city to do so, which exacerbated their precarious living conditions throughout the decades. Print 6. This is Freedom Road. The last two prints focus on efforts on reconciliation and restitution. This print chronicles the construction of Winnipeg's aqueduct from explorations of Shoal Lake in 1906 to reparations made to the Indigenous community so deeply affected by this. The background of this print is a digitally printed map of the trajectory of the Shoal Lake aqueduct from 1918. Centrally located are the houses of Winnipeg, while the Indigenous families of Shoal Lake number 40 are pushed to the margins, as we have seen in previous prints. Their houses and homes are upended sideways along the edge of the paper. Behind the city of Winnipeg, you can see large figures of politicians and settlers printed on the backside of the paper, representing the powerful decision-makers in the colonization projects. The text excerpts begin with an article in the Manitoba Morning Free Press from 1906. Quote, "Water Commission visits Shoal Lake. The members of the Water Commission visited Shoal Lake near Kenora on Saturday to ascertain its suitability as a viable source of supply for the city. Soundings were made, the shores inspected, samples of water collected, and an effort made to gain an idea of the country lying off towards Winnipeg. This large body of water is practically the highest portion of the country. There is practically no habitation with the exception of a few Indians and an odd mining camp." Unquote. Again, the disregard for the presence of the Indigenous community is jarringly blatant here. The Manitoba Free Press reports in 1919, quote, "On the 5th of April, only a few weeks ago, the waters of Shoal Lake flowed into the mains of the city of Winnipeg. When the citizens and housewives turned on their kitchen taps, it was pure, sweet, soft, and sparkling water that splashed into their sinks. For nearly 4 years, the construction and engineering went steadily and successfully forward. An aqueduct of more than 96 miles long was constructed. Sums of money exceeding $14.5 million were expended. Tunnels were sunk and carried under the beds of rivers. Scores of miles of railway trackage was laid down to haul the material of construction. An army of men was employed. When the water was finally delivered to the people of Winnipeg, the supply from which they drew, the water district which had been created for them was one of the largest and most notable on the whole American continent. And the finished accomplishment, the Greater Winnipeg Water District, constituted one of the greatest pieces of constructive engineering in the history of Canada. Here is a water supply worthy indeed of a great Western city." Unquote. Professor of History at the University of Manitoba, Adele Perry, explains in a Free Press article from 2016, quote, "Shoal Lake 40 has been paying for our water for a century. In 1915, the federal government transferred more than 3,000 acres of Shoal Lake 40's reserve land to the Greater Winnipeg Water District for the sum of $1,500. The interests of the settler city were placed above those of Indigenous people, even to lands supposedly reserved for them. For Shoal Lake 40, the consequences have been enormous." Unquote. Will Braun, senior writer for the Canadian Mennonite, writes in 2014, quote, "Winnipeg Mennonites follow their drinking water to its source. On October 9th, 2014, 5 carloads of concerned Winnipeg citizens, including 2 Mennonite Church Canada representatives, traveled 160 kilometers eastward to the other end of the aqueduct that has supplied Winnipeg's water since 1919. There, Chief Irwin Red Sky and other community members shared their story. Following the visit, Steve Heinrichs, Director of Indigenous Relations for MC Canada, said, "Winnipeggers need to know where their water comes from and make sure the situation is addressed." Unquote. Winnipeg Free Press journalist Chinta Puxley writes in 2015, quote, "Some Winnipeg councillors say the city has a moral responsibility to help build a road for a reserve that has been cut off from the mainland for the last century so the Manitoba capital can have clean water. Councillor Jenny Gerbasi said the tour of Shoal Lake 40 was powerful and suggested helping to build an all-weather road for the man-made island would be an important act of reconciliation. After years of fighting for basic human rights, Chief Erwin Redsky said his people are finally feeling optimistic. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is getting brighter each day, he said Tuesday. It's been 100 years, and we're looking forward to a new beginning, unquote. In December 2015, Winnipeg Free Press journalist Bartley Kivas writes, quote, "The sound of drumming reverberated around the legislature's grand staircase Thursday as all three levels of government agreed to end the century-long isolation of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. The federal, provincial, and civic governments formalized their commitment to build an all-weather road to the northwestern Ontario Anishinaabe community. I never thought I'd live to see this," said lifelong Shoal Lake 40 resident Anne Redsky. Redsky said she's been wary of making the crossing between her island and the mainland since she was thrown from a motorboat and nearly drowned in the late 1990s. Everybody has a story. Every fall and spring is a dangerous time. Chief Erwin Redsky praised activists for promoting the need to build an all-weather road and thanked Winnipeggers for supporting it, unquote. In the summer of 2019, Winnipeg Free Press journalist Kelly Geraldine Malone reports, quote, "This is Freedom Road. Shoal Lake, Ontario. For the first time in his life, Chief Erwin Redsky won't have to fight for each small stone that lies along the 24-kilometer road that connects his First Nation to the outside world after more than a century of isolation. He looks down the long road, the long, wide gravel land link, and predicts it is his community's path to the future. This is Freedom Road," unquote. Print 7, Navi Odena, an example of reconciliation in action. In the final print, the background is a map of Winnipeg's River Heights and Tuxedo neighborhoods with a white blank space of the new urban reserve, Navi Odena. Figures of Indigenous people fill the center, the blank space of the image, while in previous prints, the figures were pushed to the margins. The blank space outlining the land of the former Cap Yong Barracks site symbolizes a kind of blank slate for a new beginning. Figures of settler families and politicians gather along the side of the new reserve, tentatively touching and overlapping with the Indigenous figures to indicate new social and cultural connections. The Winnipeg houses are printed upside down, symbolizing a change in the colonial systems in society. To me, Navi Odena represents a new space through which the relationships and perceptions between settlers and Indigenous communities are beginning to change. I start the narrative with the closing of the Cap Yong military barracks at the corner of Grant Avenue and Kenaston Boulevard. Winnipeg Free Press reporter Alexandra Paul writes in 2004, quote, "The future of the soon-to-be vacated Cap Yong Barracks is still undecided, with possible uses including housing, green space, and expanding Kenaston Boulevard. As well, the Broken Head and Long Plain First Nations say they should get the 65-hectare site because land is owed them under treaty agreements," unquote. An article by Deborah Fraze in the Canadian Mennonite further explains that, quote, 3 years later, the Federal Treasury Board attempted to sell the site to the Canada Lands Company, a Crown corporation, for dispersal. But before that sale could be completed, a group of First Nations communities challenged it in court on the basis of treaty agreements with the federal government. Steve Heinrichs, former Mennonite Church Canada's Director of Indigenous Relations, further explains in the article that, quote, "In 1871, the government promised more land to Treaty 1 signatories than it delivered. In order to meet that deficit, the federal government is legally required to offer any Crown lands labeled as surplus, such as Kapyong Barracks, to Treaty 1 communities, unquote. This led to years of negotiations and legal battles, as well as skepticism from the surrounding neighborhoods, the latter of which was addressed in a series of panel discussions hosted by CMU, the Canadian Mennonite University, between 2014 and 2015. In 2019, a Kapyong settlement is finally reached. Tessa Vanderhart writes in the Winnipeg Free Press, quote, Treaty 1 First Nations signed truly remarkable deal. After 17 years of negotiations and legal battles, Treaty 1 First Nations signed a huge settlement agreement Friday to buy the former Kapyong Barracks from the federal government. It's a very, very beautiful day, historically, to be here with you, said Long Plain Chief Dennis Meaches, speaking on behalf of the 7 Treaty 1 members. The final deal follows an agreement in principle signed in April by Broken Head Ojibwe, Sagin, Long Plain, Peguis, Russo River Anishinaabe, Sandy Bay, and Swan Lake. I believe that our ancestors are smiling on us today, said Broken Head Chief Deborah Smith. Today signifies, for me, economic reconciliation, unquote. Nigan Sinclair, Associate Professor in Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, said, quote, the development of the Kapyong site represents a true opportunity for reconciliation in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada. At Kapyong, some Indigenous people can finally get back some of the territory they are owed, he said. This is an opportunity for Indigenous nations to have a real venue to be able to create relationships and partnerships with Winnipeggers and Manitobans, unquote. Kapyong's future could mark a more just chapter in Canada's history, lawyer Loretta Ross said. I think anytime you have an opportunity for the First Nation community and non-First Nation community to coexist is a form of reconciliation, unquote. What stood out to me in these last 2 prints, where I portray beautiful and hopeful outcomes of the reconciliation process, is the arduous, lengthy, and persistent legal fight Indigenous communities have to go through to receive some form of restitution to this day. Perhaps as a community of allies grows, we can demand a future in which these battles for justice and respect won't have to be so hard fought for. When I look at the change in public perception and attitudes, a greater understanding of colonization processes and systemic racism, the change in language and representation in our local newspaper, I am hopeful that things will continue to change for a better and more inclusive society. As Paul Samin, editor-in-chief of the Winnipeg Free Press, writes in 2021 on the future of the Winnipeg Free Press, quote, there are many things a good newspaper needs to be. A light that exposes injustice, a magnifying glass that brings into focus what otherwise might be missed, a signpost to help you navigate the way to events that matter to you. The commitment that began with an apology for the times when our coverage has fallen short, had been blind to those marginalized by the color of their skin, and cases when we have been part of the problem, not the solution, has already led to change within the Free Press newsroom, unquote. In conclusion, the impacts of colonization continue to pervade everything in our lives today. Social structures and systems, our perception of land and property, the content we are taught in school and read in the media, the way we think about, interact with, and treat others on whose land we now live, and whose experiences are not always represented in the media or taught in schools. This artist's book invites us to question our biases, our perceptions, our understandings of history and the narratives we grew up with, and challenges us to decolonize our thinking. if you would like to spend more time reading Storied Land, Remapping Winnipeg, you can access a digital version of the artist's book at either my blog, miriamrudolph.blogspot.com, or which you can also access through my website if that's easier to remember, miriamrudolph.com. You can, of course, spend some time tonight here as well, but again, it's a lot of text, so you can take it home with you as well. Thank you. Yes. Yes, are there any questions? Yes, Anne. The question is, in this print here, about the railway, why is one little house red? It's a compositional detail. Yes. No, for the most part, I chose the color red to be kind of the thread of the theme of colonization going through, which is why I also chose to have the one house, one of the larger houses in red. And, oh, it's been so long since I made it. I think maybe I wanted to signify, too, that the Mennonite settlers settled there. So, yeah, today, I think 30% of the population, or 29% of the population today in the North End is Indigenous. So I did want to kind of present, too, that there were also settlers in the early, or it was more of a migrant quarters in the early years. Yes, they're all printed with copper etchings aside from the digital components. Yes. Mm-hmm. I had it written down. It's the heart of the center of our community. Does that sound about right? I think Odina's heart. Yeah. Yeah, it's I think at the heart and the center of the community. I had it in the long version of my presentation. There was a longer one.
When you were delving into the Mennonite settler history and perhaps your own relations to that, what was the most surprising thing you found?
I think, I don't know if there was a moment of surprise per se, as more years of realization, because I grew up with the narrative in Paraguay. There was nothing here when we came. We made something of this wilderness through our hard work. And only as an adult did I come across narratives of Indigenous people describing how they experienced the quasi-invasion of their land. And for me, it was really surprising that it took me almost 30 years until I came across that other narrative, I think. Yeah. So the question is, how will this work that you see here now lead to new work that I will create from a decolonization perspective? I don't know yet. I've been focusing so much towards this point, but this was already the follow-up to another project where I worked with decolonization. So yeah, I'm not sure yet where it will go, but I'm sure it will continue to inspire, be a stepping point towards other work in that same direction. Yeah, and for me, this was the first time where I really engaged too with the colonial history of Winnipeg, because I've done mapping of Winnipeg for over 15 years, but those maps are a lot more benign than the prints that I displayed here. Like they were more a way for me to connect with the city or to find a sense of belonging after moving here, finding my way. So they focus more on neighborhoods and landmarks and kind of the feel-good parts of the city. And yeah, I'm not sure yet how that will influence maybe that kind of work too, now knowing how many more, or knowing of the existence of all the other layers underlying the neighborhoods. We'll see. Sorry, I can't quite answer your question. Yeah. Bill.
You represent the unique quality of a researcher and an artist. So when the Free Press first approached you, did they approach you as an artist? I would think they would know of your artwork more so than of your interest in research, but I may be naive on that.
Mm-hmm.
Was that art first, and then all the other, the historical stuff that came to it?
I think it was both. I was invited by the Winnipeg Art Gallery for the Free Press project. And they had seen a previous project I had worked with where I also combined art and research, and they liked what they saw. Hey, Riva. and kind of asked me to do something similar with the research and art creation. With a focus on the Winnipeg history. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I will be around to answer them in person as well. So yeah, thank you again, everyone, for coming. It's been a delight to have you all here.